So good morning, everybody. We are having folks join us live, continuing to trickle in. So good morning. So nice to see everybody's faces. Please feel free to turn your cameras on and introduce yourselves in the chat. We're set to start right at 9:30 and it's a minute past. So I'm gonna hop into my housekeeping items. So good morning, my name is Maggie Dixon. I am the Home Visiting Coordination Initiative, or HVCI Development Coordinator with Prevent Child Abuse New York. And we coordinate this monthly webinar series to have an opportunity for conversation and learning. Just quickly before we hop into today, a couple quick remarks. We have closed captioning services enabled. If you head to the bottom of your screen, you're going to see a little button that says CC. If you click that or hover over a little arrow, you should be able to hit show subtitle and see those services. We are recording today's session. It will be available via email and on our website, accessible to those that have registered. After today's session, I'm going to be sending a follow-up email with resources and a link to the survey and a survey link, since the HVCI is a project, a federally funded project of the Preschool Development Birth Through 5 grant. So we please ask that our participants fill that out, not only so our speaker can have some feedback, but as it is a requirement of the grant. And also today, something very special. For folks that have joined us live, you will be entered to win a copy of The Sex-Wise Parent, written and authored by our speaker today. So that's very exciting. So as Dr. Janet and I'm sorry, I didn't clear this with you beforehand, but could you please pronounce your last name? Is it Rosenzweig or Zweig?
Zweig.
Rosenzweig.
Yes.
So Dr. Janet Rosenzweig's book, The Sex-Wise Parent, will be available 2 copies to lucky winners today. So stay tuned and stick around to the end for that. And finally, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker. Dr. Janet Rosenzweig has enjoyed a 4-decade career in social work and public administration, focusing on child welfare. Most recently, as Executive Director, the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children, or APSAC. Immediately prior, she served as the Vice President for Research and Programs for Prevent Child Abuse America, where she worked very closely with Healthy Families America. Prior to that, she was the Executive Director of Prevent Child Abuse New Jersey, where she played a critical role in integrating the various home visiting models into a comprehensive service system and initiated the TANF incentive for parents, which brought home visiting to young parents receiving TANF, or Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. She was the founding director of the Project Against Sexual Abuse of Appalachian Children in Knoxville, Tennessee, Executive Director of Girls Clubs of Dallas, and served in the cabinet of Mercer County, New Jersey government as the Human Services Director for 9 years. Janet served as acting executive director of the Society for the Scientific Study of Sexuality and combined her training in human sexuality and child welfare to write The Sex-Wise Parent, The Parent's Guide to Protecting Your Child, Strengthening Your Family, and talking to kids about sex, abuse, and bullying. She currently serves on multiple boards, teaches at the University of Pennsylvania, manages a consulting practice with nonprofit organizations, writes for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and blogs at sexwiseparent.com. Janet holds a BS in Family Studies and an MS in Health Education, both from the Pennsylvania State University, a PhD in Social Work from Rutgers University, and a Master's in Public Administration from Harvard's Kennedy School. You can reach Dr. Rosenzweig and view additional resources at sexwiseparent.com. So we are very, very pleased to be joined today by Dr. Janet Rosenzweig, and I'm very excited to learn from her today and for the session today.
Okay. Are we all, is the technology working? Everybody can hear me? Maggie, we're all good. My slides are broadcasting. Yay.
I can hear you. Yep.
Perfect. If at any time my slides start transitioning, if you would just kind of break in and let me know. That sometimes happens with Zoom. Great. Well, first of all, let me say a great big thank you and welcome to all of you for joining us first thing on a Monday morning when I'm sure your inboxes are full. You've got clients, you had to get kids off to school. So this first thing on a Monday, thank you so very much for making it a point to join with us today. I obviously find this a critical topic. I've devoted this portion of my career to it, and I'm delighted that you're joining us and hopefully feel that this is important as well. And let's see, the slides are not moving. There we go. So this presentation today is brought to you by, here's our commercial, the New York State Initiative to Prevent Child Sexual Abuse. This is an initiative that's been going on for about a year. The people behind it, you see on the slide, you see their logos, you see a description of the New York State Initiative, but most importantly, if you could look at the bottom and see our website, newyorkpreventsexabuse.org, write that down, hang on to that, visit it frequently because new resources and information will be consistently posted there. And we're particularly interested in your feedback as the members of our New York community that are out working directly with families to let us know what else you need. So please, if you haven't heard of us before, and you probably haven't, let me introduce you to the New York State Initiative to Prevent Child Sex Abuse and encourage you to take advantage of our information and materials. So our learning objectives for today, and we're going to kind of, this is not for CME or, social work credit. So we're going to follow these objectives, but if your interests take us off in a different direction, I'm really flexible, but the objectives I'm bringing today are, first of all, to introduce you to a new info card, a resource that you can use directly when you're working with families that provides parents information and tips to promote healthy sexuality. We're going to talk about components of psychosexual development, sexual and reproductive anatomy, and how to incorporate this very sensitive information into home visiting. We're going to focus particularly on one piece of the anatomy and physiology that I think is crucial in our work in promoting sexual health and safety, and that's understanding the sexual response cycle. And we'll, use some of this to process how this can impact our work as home visitors as we're working directly with families. This is, you heard my background, and I thank Maggie. That was a lovely introduction. These are the books that I've written after having a career. I guess what I didn't put in my introduction is that I began my work in this field when I came out of school the first time in the late 70s with a master's degree in health education, and I'd been certified as a sex educator. I studied with Masters and Johnson. Some of you may remember who they were, other than the TV show that was made about them. They really were the pioneers of the field of sexual health back starting in the 60s. And so my focus really was on human sexuality, having worked in family planning. And I moved to Knoxville, Tennessee. And the only job that I could find that had anything to do with anything that would use my credentials in human sexuality was working on a child sex abuse project. Some of you may know CAPTA, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act. That's the federal law that in essence created our profession. The entire formal CPS, Child Protective Services system, was born out of the passage of CAPTA, which was written in 74. Passed in 78. It was so bipartisan that it was written by Walter Mondale, very liberal Democrat, and signed by Richard Nixon, very conservative Republican. And so money for child sex abuse started flowing from CAPTA right around the time I was looking for my first job out of graduate school. And I got invited to work on hired to work on a sex abuse helpline. A very smart man down in Knoxville figured if he had money to hire 2 people to run a sex abuse helpline, if he hired one that understood child abuse, so he hired a CPS worker, and one that understood human sexuality, so he hired a sex educator, if he put us together, we'd figure out what to do with this child sex abuse stuff. Because in 1978, there really was no body of knowledge. People were still thinking that claims of sex abuse were kind of Freudian incest fantasies, which of course was not the case. So that's just to kind of let you know, I came into this field as a sex educator, and wherever I've been in government at Prevent Child Abuse America, I've always kept the perspective that I am a sex educator working within the child welfare system to bring what we know from the field of human sexuality to help us prevent and treat child sex abuse. So my perspective, I'm very strongly developmental perspective. Individuals and systems, including family systems, change over time. Those changes often go in a very specific developmental sequence, and we need to understand those sequences. So, successfully completing one sets us up to complete the next. As I said, I'm a health and sex educator. I've staffed a sex abuse helpline, been a counselor, a therapist, and a staff trainer, spent many years being a public official working in child welfare, and a prevention specialist and a mom. Now, your perspectives, I'd like us to take a minute and think about that, because all of us on this call today are coming to this session with different education, different experiences, and most importantly, different personal backgrounds. I understand that sexuality is a very sensitive and personal topic. I know that some of you, I can see on Zoom, some of you are in conference rooms sitting with peers, some of you are at home, and I urge you to consider thinking about keeping a notepad by your side and jotting down not only questions you may have, which we'll get to at some point, but any reactions and reflections on the content, just for your own information. Because, this is not like coming to a lecture on math. We bring feelings, we bring history, we bring happiness, we may bring anxiety. So I want to respect that. And it's a little difficult to tune into people's feelings when we're on Zoom, but I urge you to take care of yourself. We come to this with our own values and experiences. Some are really good experiences and some are not so good experiences. And if you start to feel uncomfortable, feel free to zone out. This is, again, it's your prerogative to take care of yourself, because we will be doing content, but it is guaranteed to bring up feelings. I also find that in these workshops, many people apply the content to their own parenting. I think that's great. So if your work has you working 0 to 3, but if you want to ask a question about your 14-year-old, please have at it, because the more comfortable we are integrating the sexuality information into our own selves, the easier it'll be for us to bring it to work. So listen to what you want to listen to, zone out if you feel like you need to zone out, keep notes, ask questions, and take this next hour that I'll be giving to you and make it your own in any way that you can. So one of our goals for today is to introduce this brochure that we're going to be making available to you. We'll be sending it to you as a PDF. There are some copies available for printing, and it's something that you can consider either using for your own reference or something that you can consider handing out to parents when you have, when you're doing your home visits, or if you're having parent education sessions back at your center. So we're very proud of this. We've worked very hard on it. Several people on this call have been part of it. So you will be receiving a PDF of our note card that you'll be able to share with families. And I'm not going to spend this session reading it line by line. You certainly are able to do that, but our time today is more going to be setting a broader context. And then at the end, we'll be looking at this a little bit more closely. So my focus in the work that I do, I refer to, instead of quote child sex abuse prevention, I go a little bit more broadly, and I speak about what can we all do to promote sexual health and safety. And it's a broad concept that includes a lot of things, including the prevention of sexual abuse. When people are given an opportunity to develop a healthy sexuality, they may be less likely to act out and sexually abuse or sexually hurt others. So, and we also know that sexuality has a physical, social, emotional, and spiritual components, and being healthy in all of those ways leads to a happy, healthy, and socially engaged life. So I really like us to think about, kind of if we take this broad and we can promote people being, confident in their sexuality, understanding about their sexuality, that we raise sexually safe and healthy people, not only are we working to prevent kids from avoiding being victimized, but we're hopefully going to raise people that are healthy enough that they don't become victimizers. And some of the things we're going to talk about today are going to point us in that direction as well. So why do I support sexual health and safety? Because it is a major piece in child sex abuse prevention, but more importantly, or as importantly, that's why these boxes are the same sizes, supporting sexual health and safety helps strengthen families. And that's what all of us are about if we're working in the fields that would be on this call today. Many of you may have seen this graphic from the Centers for Disease Control. They talk about the social ecology of prevention. And the CDC, when they talk about health promotion and disease prevention, they believe that whatever the issue we're working on, whether it's seatbelts or not smoking or preventing violence, we have to work in 4 levels of what they call the social ecology. We have to target interventions in individuals. We have to target individual interventions at relationships, which could be like parent-child or family. We have to target interventions at communities, which is, in this sexual health and safety, what are our community standards on these issues? And we have to target some issues around society. What are our laws? Today, as working, with the home visiting group, we're going to be primarily focusing on the individual and relationship level and things that we should know and can do to promote sexual health and safety at the individual and relationship level. When we start with that, and I don't want to get all sciencey and researchy, but for people that like these kind of studies, I am a real fan of this really wonderful long-term study called the Fragile Family Studies that came out of Princeton starting, I believe, in the 90s, where they followed families, and they refer to fragile families as families with one parent. Now, with someone that raised a son as a single parent, I don't feel all that fragile, so I'm not sure I love the name, so get that out of the way. But what they studied families over decades where they were single parents raising the kids. And one of the findings from the Fragile Family Studies that I find important to this is that at the time of birth, most parents are still romantically involved and have high hopes they will get married and stay together, but most are not able to establish stable unions or long-term co-parenting. So 5 years after birth, 1/3 of the dads have virtually disappeared. Just kind of take that thought, and if you are a parent, and I'm in the privacy of wherever you're listening, I don't want you to answer this question out loud, but one of the things that resonates for me, both from experience personally with friends, from the literature, we know how hard it is, how difficult it is to reestablish a sexual relationship after childbirth. And you guys as home visitors are working with families right at this critical time of their life. And, when families that have made the commitment to marriage in front of God and whatever other authority, when they're struggling, how much harder is that when families that don't have that commitment? I think the point I'm saying is one of the things that we know from what we hear from the Fragile Family Studies and from other research on sexuality at different stages of couples, that period right postpartum is a very difficult time to keep couples engaged. So if we can just think about that as one of the things we bring to our work as home visitors. How are you? And asking the mom, how are you and the dad doing? And just while understanding that taking care of their body and their spirit and their baby is going to come first, how we might kind of promote that it's helping dads understand what to expect, that, you know, the kind of sex they expected is going to take a month or two to come back, and they're, you know, man enough to wait that long, and helping mom understand that the dad still having sexual urges is normal and expected, and doesn't mean they don't love that person. So would love to do a whole workshop on you know, kind of the sexual relationship right in the neonatal part of family development. But for this workshop today, I just put that out there as a thought that I like to leave home visitors with. Just, you know, to the extent that you're comfortable keeping that in play, it's just something to think about. And if it's not appropriate, or if it doesn't fit, just put it on the back burner. But the role that I think that is very important for home visitors comes from a model that was developed a long time ago by a guy named Jack Annan, and it was adopted by ASECT, which is the American Association of Sex Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. And what they say is almost all sexual issues can be dealt with by permission, limited information, specific suggestions, and intensive therapy. So what Jack Annan in this model tells us is that the overwhelming majority of issues and questions about human sexuality can be dealt with in the first two areas: permission to be sexual and limited information about how your body and the body of other people work. Leave the specific suggestions of what to do in intensive therapy to sex therapists. No one is asking anybody on this call to go there. But to the extent that you're comfortable, and to the extent that it feels appropriate, how are you at giving people permission to express their sexuality in a healthy way, and the limited information that they need about how bodies and relationships function to enable them to do it? So it's a tool that we can offer parents, and professionals can role model the permission and limited information aspect of this very important you know, concept. Maybe by, you know, if we were in person, we would be doing some role playing and some practicing about, you know, how we might share information. And I know that's not easy to do on a Zoom, but just kind of take in the concept and, you know, what do I need in order for me to be able to feel like I can give people the permission and the limited information. So as a trusted home visitor, you're in a great, you know, position to be the permission and limited information in your community, again, to the extent that fits with your service model and your comfort level. Why do I think this is so important now in the year 2022? Well, a little bit of history. Access to accurate information about human sexuality was strongly curtailed back in the 90s. I mean, when I first came into this work, I mean, I was doing sex abuse prevention work in the hills of East Tennessee in the late 70s, and absolutely was never censored about what we said to who and where. I can remember doing workshops in the community room in churches with anatomically correct models in the room, you know, talking, you know, one of my favorite things was to do mother-daughter workshops where moms would bring their teenage daughters, and together we would discuss, you know, what genitalia are made of and the menstrual cycle. And so many things started changing in the 90s that made those kinds of opportunities next to impossible. One of the things that happened were the Megan's laws that all started passing. You know, the first one passed in the early 90s. They went federal in 94. And I have to say, particularly talking to a New York group, I don't take Megan's laws lightly. As Maggie mentioned earlier, I was my county's human services commissioner, and it was in the 90s, and I was the commissioner in Mercer County when Megan died in Mercer County. I know the Kanka family. I was right there, and I don't take this lightly at all. But what happened afterwards, when Mrs. Kanka learned that there was a sex offender living in her neighborhood, and the police knew he was there, but she did not, she started lobbying for what are called, to open what is now become known as SORNA, Sex Offender Registration and Notification Act. Sex offenders have been registering for years, but it was the Megan's Law that said, hey, if the cops know there's guys in my neighborhood, I'm a mom and I want to know this guy's in the neighborhood. So that's when the registries became open and public. And people started relying on the registries instead of traditional sex abuse prevention programs. I mean, if I look up in the registry and there's no bad guys in my neighborhood, then I guess my kid is going to be safe. And boy, that really was the mentality in the mid to late 90s. Many of you, I see some folks that are probably, I don't see many of you, but I do see some that are probably too young to remember the 90s. We also know that in 90s, we had abstinence only funding coming into health education, which again, not only impacted what kids were taught in school, but as Maggie mentioned, when I was in Texas, I was executive director of Girls Clubs of Dallas, which are now we have boys and girls clubs because of a whole different thing. But I mean, we were serving, inner city kids in an environment of their own. And I spent many an afternoon in a room covered with beanbag chairs and me and a bunch of kids sprawled out on a floor, again, looking at anatomically correct diagrams to help understand how bodies works. And that was, I could not have done that once the abstinence only funding come, because Girls Club had gotten money from federal funds. One of the most chilling things that happened, and some of you may remember, in 1994, we had a wonderful Surgeon General named Jocelyn Elders, the first African-American and first female Surgeon General in the United States, brought into office. And she was at a World AIDS Day conference, and someone asked her a question about, did you think masturbation is something we should be teaching kids? And she answered kind of, well, masturbation is a safer form of sex, and it's a good idea for kids to understand that. Well, 2 weeks later, some publication that had it in for her boss, President Clinton, and a lot of people had it in for President Clinton for anything that had to do with sex, came after Dr. Elders, started painting her in the press as someone who was going to require schools to teach masturbation. She was one of the first victims of an internet crusade, and it ruined her career, and it forced her to step down as Surgeon General. So what does that tell other health professionals when they see their own Surgeon General being forced out of her job for answering a question about masturbation? What happened is adults, even the most well-intentioned adults, stopped talking to kids about sex. And what that does is it leaves kids vulnerable to getting accurate information about and values about sexuality. So where they go now, they go to their peers, they go online. And when they go online, they're most likely getting pornography, which is teaching them very difficult things. And we could spend a whole session just on what pornography does to kids. But the point of all of this, to bring it to our discussion today, is the members of the generation educated under these restrictions are now the parents. So, and they need your help to be able to bring healthy sexuality education and information into their families, because they did not get it in school. They did not get it at Boys and Girls Club. They did not get it at the Y. Maybe they got it at their faith-based institution. I know one example, the Unitarian Church has the OWL program, Our Whole Life, which is a literally cradle to grave healthy sexuality. Other religious denominations also have wonderful information. But it seems that, if we talk about where sex information should come from, it gets political if we talk about schools. And so let's leave the politics to the public officials. But no one questions a parent's right, if not responsibility, to bring sexual information into their families. And you, as the home visitors, can bring that information to the parents. And again, to the extent that you're comfortable and to the extent that you're ready. So we, through the New York State Initiative, we want to help provide you with the kind of resources, including examples of the brochure, of the information card that the initiative developed, which we're going to be sharing with you, a brochure that I helped develop that I will be sharing with you as well. Because one of the things that we know is that people think that the internet killed the brochure, And that's just not true. There's research that shows that, specifically the study I'm thinking about is in medical offices, that when people leave a visit with something tangible in their hands, they actually feel like they got more out of the visit than if they leave empty-handed. So if so I just want to leave you with the point that, while budgets might have killed the pamphlet and the brochure, don't let the fact that everyone has a smartphone be an excuse not to try to keep some printed material. Only the stuff you really love, that you really think the parents are going to love. Don't let the internet be, your budget guys use the internet as an excuse not to print anything anymore. Parents are very happy when you leave them with something that they can look at. So let me just take a little break before we get into the anatomy and physiology fact stuff, and ask Maggie if any questions have shown up in the chat, but this might be a good time to address.
Don't see any questions yet. So we can keep moving and I'll keep monitoring. All
right. Well, that was also an excuse to take a sip of my tea. So thank you. Okay. So let's get to the facts. So I'm going to talk a little bit about psychosexual development. The slides I use in this section are a little bit dense, so I'm going to just kind of top line all of them. But if you feel like I've glossed over something and gone too fast and you want to know more, I'm going to make these slides available and you'll be able to download the whole PDF. You can follow the links, you can read the fine print. So, I'm leaving it all there so that you can have the slides, but I am going to kind of gloss over some of the, I'm not going to sit there and read every bit of content that I've got there. So what does psychosexual development refer to? Again, most of you have heard or quite familiar with the phrase. What we mean by psychosexual development are the normal and predictable phases an individual goes through as they develop their sex role, their sex preference, their gender identity, and how all of this fits together to make them the person who they can be. One of the models that I like to use when I talk about these things is there are not to confuse, there's at least 3 dimensions to a person's sexuality. Sex role is what are the behaviors that a society ascribes to one gender or another. Sex role is completely a societal construct, right? Sex preference, what is the body type? What is the physical body type of the person someone prefers as a sexual partner? That develops over time as part of psychosexual development. And gender identity is what gender does a person really believe they are. That concept is so much easier to explain now than it was 10 years ago, because gender identity is getting so much attention. And I would imagine if some of you working with families that, now that we're kind of, parents are listening to kids and they're hearing more and more about kids identifying as trans at younger and younger ages, I know that gives parents a lot of pause. That's really kind of a 21st century phenomenon, and the one that we can talk about. But for the purposes of this discussion, making sure that we kind of know that sex role, sex preference, and gender identity are 3 separate constructs in developing developing who we are as a sexual human being, and that all of the developments happen in phases. I like to start and go back to good old Freud every now and then. A lot of what he said is a kind of sexist and old, but it really forms a basis for so much of what people teach, learn, believe. And the stages that he identified really have held up over the generations. So we know that babies are born and their first stage is the oral stage. And, the big word there is polymorphous perverse. Babies just want to feel good. And you know this from your home visiting training. This is kind of the basis of all this, of all the psychoanalysis and all the stuff that underlines everyone's been teaching us in the home visiting field about parent-child bonding. A baby needs to bond to a warm, safe, loving adult and know that their physical needs are going to be met, so that they learn that the world is safe. Because if they don't learn the world is safe, until they learn the world is safe, they're never going to feel comfortable venturing out. So, whether it's the feeding, it's the holding, it's the cuddling, it's they want to know that their needs will be met, and it is safe to be a sentient being in this universe. And in Freud's language, this is where people develop an id, my pleasure, because and babies, this is normal for babies. They can't comprehend anything except that this little tiny body their soul has come wrapped up in, it needs to feel safe. It needs to be fed. It needs to be warm. It needs to be nurtured. It needs to feel good. And that's totally normal. Now, parents, this can be a little difficult for, especially the younger parents or under-resourced parents, because babies, and this, that if you've had any home visiting training, infants are demanding, and infants don't care how the grown-up feels. They aren't capable of caring how the grown-up feels. But, again, the oral stage and learning that the world is safe and they'll be well taken care of is critical for these first, 18 months of life. The second stage is the anal stage, and that's where kids are learning kind of to get their sense of self, the right and wrong. And kind of the battleground, or the area where that's played out, is with potty training and gratifying activities that they're going to learn that that pooping feels good. They may even learn that they can control their parents, and one way they can get attention from their parents is by pooping inappropriately at the wrong time or place. So this is just such a critical point for the parent-child to really develop, to get in sync with what the child can control, what the parent wants to control. And this is, again, an important time for parents to understand what the baby can physically do and can't physically do. They can't physically control their sphincter muscles until they're 1.5, sometimes 2, sometimes later for boys and girls. And parents can get cranky when he's doing this just to get, my sister kid trained at 18 months, and why didn't he? Well, and I'm sure in the home visiting field, you've been through a lot of the potty stuff, but what this has to do with our discussion is this is where kids develop their super ego and their sense of control and their sense of right and wrong. So successfully getting through the anal stage and happy potty training and happy parenting at the end of that really is an important step to make sure that people love their bodies, understand their bodies, that parents understand their kids' bodies. So that's kind of an important step there. And then the phallic stage, around 4 or 5-ish, kids discover their genitals. Right? They want to play with their genitals. They're curious about other people's genitals. They're going to follow their parents in the shower and look at their parents' genitals. That's completely normal. But this is where, when we work with families, and we're going to talk a little bit later about helping families develop their norms, this is when we have an opportunity to start for the parent to model boundaries. Right, which is very important lesson in sexual health and safety. When the child says, can I come, wants to come in the shower, can I see? If a parent is comfortable letting, and it feels like it's natural, that's that family's norms, it's fine. But if a parent is not comfortable, the parent needs to say so. I mean, I can recall being, very comfortable with my own kid, but when my friend's little girl followed me into the bathroom, it was a whole different story. But it's every person, every family develops their comfort level. And this is the stage when helping parents understand that touching genitalia is normal, that if they want to tell the kids not to touch their genitalia, to do it in a way that's not shame-based, and we'll talk more about that later. But this is really kind of an important stage for parents to understand. And for some kids, all of these numbers are just sort of like younger. I mean, some kids it's going to start at 3, some kids it's going to start a little bit later, but these are kind of the developmental phases the little ones go through. We'll skip all this detail, and you're welcome to read it later. And then I want to talk about the latency stage, which starts around puberty. And people kind of consider from age 5 to puberty what's called the golden age of parenting, because this is still the age where the parent is still considered brilliant, because by the time they hit puberty and become a teenager, all of a sudden the parent has suddenly become very stupid, and the kind of weird kid, their best friend's older brother is now the expert on everything. But we've really got our kids' attention between like 5 and puberty, and this is really the time when parents can really inject their values, their beliefs, and what they want their kids to know about privacy and respect and love and care and all the stuff that goes into that goes into being a sexually safe and healthy adult. But this is the age where kids are highly vulnerable to pedophiles, because they're in the latency stage, and their genitals and anything sexual is far, far away from anything center stage. They're not particularly interested, which means that they could be makes them more vulnerable. A younger kid or a teenager feels a hand on their thigh, they're going to know pretty quickly a hand on my thigh doesn't belong there. A 6-year-old is not going to be as quick because, again, being in the latency stage, it's not front of mind. Also, this may be the age that pedophiles find most attractive because these kids have not developed secondary sex characteristics yet. So again, this is a stage that's a great time for parents to kind of really inject everything they want their kids to know, and they will take it with them into puberty and that adolescence. They'll just act like they're not listening. But anyway, this is an important time. So, any questions on that before we move into the next stage the next topic?
No questions
All right.
about content.
Okay. So probably, if nothing else I share with you today stays with you, I think the next section is the one that I consider the most important. And that's understanding the fundamentals of human sexual response. Human sexual response refers to the fact that the human body will react to various kinds of stimulations with very specific physical manifestations. That is, that when a human body has a thought, a memory, a touch, a feeling, something they're watching on a screen, something they're interacting with a partner that makes them feel sexually aroused, it is an autonomic response. You cannot sit here right now and will yourself to get sexually aroused. Similarly, you can't sit here right now and will yourself not to get sexually aroused, but a person finds themselves in a situation of a memory, a touch, a feeling, whatever it is, and that process begins, right? And this is the part, if you've been through some sexual trauma, some of this may be triggering. So take a deep breath, take a break for a minute. But the physical stuff I find is important for people to understand, because as I'll give you some examples later, understanding that sexual or genital response is an autonomic response, that something your body just does, analogous to getting goosebumps when you're cold, really helps people who have been victimized and have been one of the multiplicity, if not the majority, of victims whose bodies have responded in a genital manner. Suddenly they think it's their fault because their bodies did what their bodies did. The male got an erect penis, the female got a lubricated vagina. It's like, oh my God, if my body did this, am I really a victim? Yes. And the reason we need to understand this and help parents understand this is one of the most critical protective factors we can give to kids is to understand that even if their body responded to something inappropriate, it does not mean they were a willing partner. And that is, so if you take nothing else away from our 90 minutes to get together today, an understanding of the sexual genital response as being an autonomic reaction is key. And for parents, any mom that's changed, or dad, or anybody that's changed a little boy's diaper and sees a little baby erection sticking up at the parent, that's a perfect time to be able to say, yes, genital response is a reflex. When a penis or a vagina feels a certain way, that's what it's going to do. Just like with grown-ups, they're just, but with a child, it's not sexual, it's just genital. So that's a great teaching moment if a mom or a dad ever brings up, why is my little boy's penis sticking up? Is he a pervert? Oh. Anyway, I'm sorry, I heard some noise, but that's, and I'm going to probably repeat this about 11 more times in our next half hour together, because I think it's probably the most important point I want to be able to leave you with today. Again, the physical, sexual, or genital arousal is managed by the autonomic nervous system. That's the part of the body that's, responsible for things that are not consciously directed, like breathing, your heart beating, and your digestion. Right. So you, just like you can't tell your heart what you want your pulse to be, you can't tell your genitals when you want them to get aroused or not get aroused. If you could, who would need Viagra? Right. Well, that's a bad analogy. Forget I said that. Cut that from the recording. But, the point is that arousal is autonomic. It is not a decision that you consciously do. So that's, again, the key. It is not consciously directed. Key reasons why kids need to know this: because they may experience a genital response while they're being victimized, and predators know this, and they use this response against kids, convincing the child they were a willing participant when they're not. So even if knowing this may not prevent that first interaction with a bad guy, that first victimization, the knowledge that you were not complicit is an incredibly strong protective factor in making sure it does not happen again. Okay. One of the reasons why parents need to know this is we don't want kids having negative emotions stuck together with their own physical sexual arousal. So if we think of, if you remember kind of Pavlov's dogs experiments, what you learned about classical conditioning, if you ever had to take a psychology class, what we learned from the concept of classical conditioning is that when two things happen simultaneously, they tend to get stuck together. And, the classic example is the scientist Pavlov was trying to teach his dogs how to navigate a maze. And if they successfully got to the end, a bell would ring and they would get food. And one day, Professor Pavlov's assistant forgot to put food at the end of the maze. The bell rang and the dog salivated anyway. Right. So what happened is what they came to call contiguity of stimuli. Two things got stuck together. For the dogs in this experiment, a bell got stuck together with food. So they heard a bell and they salivated for no good reason because there was no food. And that's sort of the basis for many, 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 many studies that have come since then that have made it clear that stimuli can become contiguous or stuck together. What I'm asking, and what you can have a role with parents, is how can we help parents understand that their child's genital stimulation, genital feelings are normal autonomic responses, because we don't want parents putting negative feelings with them like fear, guilt, and shame, because at best may interfere with someone growing up to feel comfortable with their sexuality. At worst, we may end up raising someone who needs fear, guilt, or shame to become sexually aroused. And that's one of the ways that we can raise a sex offender. So helping parents understand that their child's genital reactions are as normal as goosebumps on a cold winter day is another protective factor that you as a home visitor, to the extent that you're comfortable, can bring into your work that helps promote sexual health and safety. I'm going to take a minute and ask you to read this slide, and then I'm going to tell you the story behind it. So this is a first person account from a man named Todd Bridges, who, if you're of a certain age, like mine or close, you might remember I think it was an 80s sitcom called Different Strokes, where two little boys were being raised by some rich guy out in the suburbs or whatever. But anyway, Todd Bridges was very, very famous as a child actor. And he sort of became the poster child for being the stereotypic child actor who went right down the tubes: drug addiction, crazy behaviors, arrest, jail, as a grown-up. And he wrote a book called Killing Willis. And in the book, he accounted being sexually victimized by his publicist, who, as if you read more and learn about it, the publicist was the key to his working, and his working was the key to keeping his family fed. And here is the grown-up, for everything in his and his family's life, performing oral sex on him. And to top it all off, he has his first orgasm, right? And look, no one had ever talked to me about sex before, but somehow I knew it was wrong for a man to do that to a boy. And I was really confused because it felt so good. Let me take you again back to an introductory psych class, if you ever had to take one. And we learned the word schizophrenogenic. That's things that can happen that are likely to knock people off balance. One of the ways we can really affect people's mental health is by telling them that something has two realities. Gee, this felt good. Oh my God, this was awful. How do we make these two realities exist simultaneously? And the mental health challenges of doing that really, really, really underlie a lot of the mental health dysfunctions that followed this guy for decades and decades after that. I also have to share that as you heard in my intro, I'm from Penn State. I'm very involved when the Sandusky tragedy happened at Penn State. And I guess it was in 2011, right after, they held a conference, and Sugar Ray Leonard, the, Olympic boxing champion, Golden Gloves boxing champion, just, world champion athlete, was one of the keynote speakers, who also has had kind of a difficult personal life. And Sugar Ray Leonard had also been watching the same episode of Oprah where Todd Bridges read this account on the air. And Sugar Ray, after hearing Todd read this on TV, that gave Sugar Ray, the first time in decades, the courage to come out. And he said this in his keynote at the Penn State conference. Hearing Todd say that gave him the courage to come out and talk about how he'd been abused by coaches along the way coming up as a boxer. But because he'd had an orgasm, because there'd been a climax, he didn't think he was a victim and didn't feel like he could talk about it. So, reason to know that helping kids understand that arousal and what comes after are autonomic, that's a very important protective factor. Another reason why we need to keep this in mind is that too much of our sex abuse prevention work is good touch, bad touch. That drives a kid crazy, because in the words of adults that have been victimized without physical pain and accompanying genital arousal, it's like, well, I guess what he's doing to me, if it doesn't hurt, it's not abuse. And that's really, really wildly confusing. So invited touch, uninvited touch, appropriate touch, inappropriate touch, grown-ups should never touch your genitalias unless you're at the doctor's or you're with your mom. I mean, but just stay away from that straight up black and white, good touch, bad touch. That just really, really, really confuses kids. We should model not using that language with their parents we serve. And again, key reasons why kids need to know this. Very important. And again, something many of us may have experienced is, if, especially with adolescent females, when an adolescent boy, when a male experiences arousal, he knows something's going on in his penis because the penis gets erect. It's telling him a story. Girls, nobody tells them about arousal, right? So girls get this kind of warm, fuzzy feeling down around where they just grew hair that no one told, and they have no idea what that is. And sometimes they're sitting there in the class watching this teacher who's bringing, for whatever reason, arousing these feelings in them. They can, they can easily confuse an autonomic genital response with love. And that's one of the key ways that adolescents get hooked into inappropriate relationships. And we may find that some of the moms that we work with, and and there's the studies that show how many teenage moms, the babies were fathered by guys in their 20s and 30s, and how much of that happens because we don't understand the difference between sexual arousal and honest emotional feelings. Now, I don't know that I would go into mom's personal experiences. That's not our place as home visitors, but to understand that if you present this information to parents, of course, they're bringing their own history with them when you have these conversations. But adolescents and teens are particularly vulnerable. So again, we talked about, raising kids not to associate negative feelings. We want to keep fear, guilt, and shame out of this, but we really want kids to understand that genital response is autonomic. And this I share with you. This was a handwritten note someone passed me after I did a workshop in another state. And after hearing me talk about this, she had been in a long-term relationship with a teacher, and she never knew. It is always wrong for a teacher to have sex with a 20 something high school teacher is seducing a student. That is always wrong, de facto, illegal, morally, by every standard. It's wrong. And she never felt guilty. She never felt good about it. And but the sexual piece is what kept her sucked in. So again, this knowledge, I think, is important power. So another, what I call physical fact with emotional impact, and this I'm sure you guys have heard being working in the field, is having accurate, understandable language about all the body parts, especially the genitals, is an important protective factor. And you know the drill. If they become a victim, they have language to talk about it. So to the extent that we could do that with parents, that would be great. And again, we want kids to know it's okay to talk to their parent about sex. Now, it may not be that every parent is comfortable talking to their kid about sex, but maybe if we could talk to parents with older kids, what can I offer you to help you become more comfortable? Can we practice? We're going to have the info card we're going to leave you with, but how can we help the parents become more comfortable in that role? Okay, any questions before we move into a little anatomy and physiology?
We had one question in the chat. Parents are often convinced that their children or grandchildren have been sexually abused when a child displays normal behavior, such as grabbing their genitals during a diaper change. Is there a way of discussing normal genital reactions with parents that is successful? So I guess any best practices or approaches?
That's a wonderful question. If a parent came to me with that kind of concern, my first question would be is there an adult in your child's life that you think might be a danger? So let's clear, because it may be that a parent who's having that thought maybe knows that their uncle so-and-so. So I would first start with an open-ended question and find out if they think there's a reason their child may be at risk. It may be that there was just an accusation at the child care center, or there's a member of the extended family that they're worried about. And I would get the child safety piece gently out of the way first. And once we're sure, that that's not the whole story, then it becomes appropriate to talk about genital reactions. Now, when you're talking to a parent, I wouldn't call it sexual arousal in an infant. I would call it a genital reaction. And I would say that all human beings have genital reactions that are controlled by the same part of the brain that controls breathing and goosebumps. They're autonomic reflexes, right? And I would use that language comparing it to goosebumps. Now, when I'm feeling aggressive, when I'm teaching this particularly, and I should, well, like with law enforcement officers that don't want to believe this sort of thing, one of the things I might do is walk right up to somebody and snap my fingers in their face and see, and they blink. And it's like, see, there's certain body parts of our bodies, because that's an autonomic response. I certainly would not do that to a parent, but just, within your own language, within your own resources, how you can explain a physical reflex in a context and in a way that a parent could understand. Everybody understands goosebumps. Everybody understands blinking if something comes in your eye. And, so, after clarifying that there's not an immediate, there's not something going on in the environment that's concerning them, I would teach about reflexive responses in a context and a language that I was comfortable with.
Another question here, is using accurate terms such as vagina and penis with small children beneficial, and can you explain how?
Sure. I think you, as the home visitor, should be using the anatomically correct terms. One of the things we encourage parents to do and I'm going to leave you some handouts for some like exercise things you can do with families, is for each family, for the grownups in the family, to decide together what language, what words we're going to use for genitalia, and we help set the family norms together. So if the family chooses to have their own words for genitalia, that's fine, as long as the kids also know the medical word. So in our house, we may call it a pee-pee, but when you go to the doctor, he's going to call it a penis, right? In our house, we may call it a vajayjay, but the nurse is going to call it a vagina. So, but it, I mean, I've heard parents teach their kids like they don't pee, they urinate. And, in some houses that's fine, in other houses that's others. But I encourage us as the people working with families to encourage families, and that's a great thing for if there's two parents in the home, let's decide together what language we're going to use. The kids can use that language, but then you finish it with, in our house we'll call it X, but if doctor or nurse is going to call it, and then use the medical name. And what that also does is that also helps set the stage that talking about sex is something private and personal, and there's different rules about talking about sex than there are talking about other things, right? And it sort of starts setting the stage with kids that, talking about sex is something that it's healthy to do within our families, and it's something we don't do with just everybody.
We have 2 more questions in the chat, but I will defer to you if you'd like to continue on with content, reserve questions for the end, or if you'd like to go ahead and answer them now.
Let me run through a little bit more content and leave time at the end and get all the questions.
Okay.
Okay. Right. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on some basic anatomy of physiology. The next slides are going to be anatomical line drawings, male and female reproductive organs. If you're zooming from a place where people might walk by that might not want to see line drawings of genitalia, this might be a time to turn your screen off or shut your door, but I just don't want to put pictures of genitals up on the screen for some of you that might have your 3-year-old crawling on your lap while you're zooming, or have colleagues walking into your conference room saying, what the heck is going on here? So if you're on a giant screen, a warning that a drawing of a penis is about to come up on the next slide. So what I'm going to share with you at the next part are drawings of both the male and female reproductive and genital systems that I had commissioned by medical artists, because I think they present the genitals in ways that can help us teach if we want. I've got them with the titles in it, without the titles in it. I'm happy to make these, if you want to use these as teaching aids. I've used these drawings as teaching aids with everyone from little kids to grown-ups, and they're very, very helpful, and I'm happy to share them just upon asking. But when we're looking at the male reproductive system, where with the male reproductive system, the sexual and the reproductive and sexual parts, the penis tends to do both with the female reproduction and sexuality, reproduction and urination are separate. But the key things I like to start by pointing out, if you follow on the diagram and you see the testes, you'll see that testicles are located inside a structure called the scrotum. The scrotum have a really important job, and that's to keep the testes at the correct temperature, because testes produce sperm, and sperm can only be produced at about 96 degrees, and the body is 98.6 degrees. Why am I saying, why is this important in our conversation? Well, because when a male gets colds, his scrotum are going to pull his testes closer to his body to warm them up. If kids don't understand that this is my body being normal, if grown-ups don't understand this is my body being normal, it's very frightening. We don't want people frightened about their genitalia. Remember what we said before, negative feelings about genitalia interfere with sexual health and safety. So when someone thinks, and then there's also, someone did a paper I heard once, that if you look at the literature on people with disabilities that they're not reconciled over, like, kind of like a recently, broken leg. If you're self-conscious about a body part on yourself, you're going to pay more attention to that body part on others. We don't want people being self-conscious about their genitals, because we don't want them to be paying attention to other people's genitals. So it's important to know that it is perfectly normal for scrotum to pull your testes up near your body when you get cold. And if you're real cold, like if you decide to go whitewater inner tubing where your butt is in an ice cold river, those testicles might even crawl all the way up inside your body and not come out until they're warm again. So just kind of little things that we like people to know. And and that's an example of the kind of thing it's good for little kids to be able to know, because that phenomenon is going to start happening maybe as young as 4 or 5 years old. So here's the important concepts. Oh, yeah, someone else gave me the example. What's a great teachable moment? One of my friends who used my book constantly, raising her twin boys, she told me that when one of her boys was starting to play t-ball, he was required to wear a cup to protect his genitals. And he was like, "Mom, why do I have to wear a cup and the girls don't?" And that was such a great teachable moment to help teach a little guy about, what he's got going on in his scrotum and testicles. This is the female reproductive system. I'm not going to go through it in a whole lot of detail, but I think one of the important things is very important is for females to understand their menstrual cycle. And I think that's key. Number one, I know most home visiting programs have an important value of pregnancy spacing, and understanding your menstrual cycle is very important for that. But if someone has had an experience as a victim in sex abuse, learning to understand their menstrual cycle gives them a feeling of sense of control. How can I predict my period? And so that really important thing, and again, something we could do another whole workshop on, and there's lots of things you can read about that. But understanding, what the ovaries do, that the ovaries make an egg, the egg travels down through the fallopian tube. If there's unprotected sex, sperm come in through the vagina, swim their way up to the tube, meet up an egg in the tube, and then kind of hang out in the uterus and grow into a baby. But if there's no sperm, then all the stuff in the uterus becomes the period. And yes, by the way, you're not bleeding to death if you get a period. People think blood, they get scared. One of the things I find is also reassuring to drop into conversation when appropriate is that, if someone says, "Oh, I'm bleeding like crazy," because they have their period, it's like only 10% of your menstrual fluid is blood, but because the blood is red, it colors everything. So to understand that, you're not losing that much blood, you're losing the tissue that would have supported a pregnancy if you had gotten pregnant this month. Kind of things that people need to know to feel less afraid of and more comfortable with their own sexual health and safety. This is a drawing I had of the female genitalia. Most of the pictures, if you decide you ever want to use these kind of drawings with clients, I'm happy to share these. But you'll see most of the drawings you find in textbooks show the genitalia as like the vagina is like this big open space, because they show the vagina as open. And I just couldn't find any drawings that showed what things looked like, that there's the major labia, there's the minor labia, labia. They come together at the top to form a clitoral hood, and the clitoris is under there, and the vagina is kind of tucked away between the labia. Most drawings you see just show the vagina is hanging out there, and like it doesn't. It's kind of chilling between the labia. And just again, I'm happy to make these drawings available for people if you want to ever use them in sessions with families. A couple of resources that we want to make sure that you know are available to you. This is the brochure that has been prepared for you by the New York State Initiative. And you'll see 2 slides. The first one, first we start out with some concepts that are important no matter what the age of your kids, about talking to kids. Kids need to know what's okay and what's not okay. And then we go through birth to 3 years, 3 years to 6 years, 10 to 13, and over 13, what to expect from healthy development, what's healthy and normal, and things you as a parent can do to promote healthy development. So this card will be available on our website. We'll send it to you as a PDF as a follow-up to this workshop so that you can have it available. And we encourage you to use it in whatever way feels best for you in your practice when you're working directly with parents. Some other websites with good information I encourage you to take advantage of. The American Academy of Pediatrics has this wonderful whole website called healthychildren.org. They've got the link that you'll get on this. It's maybe too long to copy the whole thing down, but they've got some really good resources about talking to your child about sex. I happen to think the resources we developed are as good, if not better, but parents are going to trust the Academy of Pediatrics, maybe more than they'll trust somebody they never heard of before. But I, encourage you to use the credibility, to use the strengths of the Academy of Pediatrics. And notice that I highlighted the second link below that. They've got all that information in Spanish as well. The National Sexual Violence Resource Center, NSVRC, they probably do the best that I've seen on producing materials, both in English and Spanish. They've got stuff that I did for them and other folks have done for them on promoting healthy sexuality as a tool to prevent sexual violence. So, and actually that was, if you read the link, that was for sexual assault, whatever, it was for Sexual Violence Prevention Month in 2013. So it's a little bit old, but it's still there in both English and Spanish. And of course, the anatomy and physiology hasn't changed. And I also encourage you, and this link will be live when you get the PDF, to go to the National Center on the Sexual Behavior of Youth and go to their resource page. They've got great resources on promoting healthy sexuality, and maybe even some things that you might find helpful if a family is in a situation where they think they're worried about, is this behavior problematic for my child? I want to kind of get toward the end by saying that parents will come out for workshops on this topic. This slide is, I guess you can tell that, well, that's me up there in the front doing a workshop in the hills of Colorado during a blizzard. And you can see those white windows. That really is a blizzard going on out there. And we filled a lecture room on a weeknight working with a local community organization to talk about promoting sexual health and safety. They provided dinner, they provided childcare, and and it literally packed this room even on a blizzard. So, I mean, with COVID, we stopped doing a lot of stuff, but experience tells us that if the logistic works, parents are interested in this issue. It's got to be presented sensitively, because many parents, all of us, come to the topic of sexuality with our own baggage, some of it good, some of it not so good. So, when you're presenting workshops in this area, you've got to make sure you're presenting it in a way that takes the cognitive as well as the affective in mind. If we go too far, parents shut down and all they do is start remembering and not hearing. But parents will come out for workshops. Parents like to be sent home with brochures, with fact cards, things that they can hold on to and things that they can work. And I encourage you to grab to download and use the resource that we've just made for you. And of course, any of my materials. And as Maggie said, people who stay and complete their evaluation and all the paperwork, Maggie's going to randomly pick out 2 people who will get 2. So we'll send 2 people free copies of my book if anybody wants to acquire it. Otherwise, it's on Amazon, or you could drop me an email and it'll be cheaper and easier, and I'll be happy to make sure you get a copy of it. Or it's easy enough, you can go to Amazon, but 2 people will get copies as door prizes or Zoom prizes if you finish all of your paperwork today. So let me now turn this over right on schedule, 15 minutes, and then open it up for Q&A. And Maggie, do you want to moderate?
Absolutely. So I'll start by heading back to the earlier questions, and if folks have more questions, please feel free to chat them in. So we have a question here that's kind of a case study or perhaps a past experience. If you could share some knowledge about how to support a mother who is pregnant for the first time, but hyper stressed about safety due to her own childhood abuse. She's worried she will lock the child up and throw away the metaphorical key to keep them safe.
Well, the first thing I would say to that mom is, some version of whatever your strongest words of encouragement are for, to say that because you feel that way, that's the first step that's telling me that you're going to be a parent that keeps your child safe. The fact that it's top of mind, I mean, I would take that and say, but let's turn that anxiety into action, and let's talk about how we can work together to make sure you help keep your child safe. And at some point, probably not right in that initial phase, my initial reaction would be strong emotional support for just the fact that she's there tells us that we're off to a fabulous start. Then there'd be some other content which we can talk about. But the other thing that I've learned to say to parents, which I have been reminded is critical, is sometimes lightning is going to strike. And sometimes, no matter what we've done, somebody's going to sneak through and get to our kid. And I need you to know and know now that if your child has the kind of relationship with you that we're going to work together to help you build, and if your child comes to you immediately, you're going to know what to do and make sure that a one-time lightning strike doesn't become ongoing abuse. And that's key. Because I have been told by clinicians, I can remember one in particular who actually said to me, damn you prevention people, you make my job so hard for parents who think they could have presented abuse, and you just have to know that sometimes it's going to happen. So I hear the words of that therapist, damn you prevention people. Now we're friends and we've talked it through, but when we're supporting parents to keep their kids safe, we've got to balance that with the reality that no intervention, no prevention is 1,000% safe. But what is almost foolproof is having that relationship with our kids so that if something does happen, they tell us immediately and we can stop it from happening again. So is that a good enough perspective to get us started? Would the person who had the question care to jump, come on and take it to the next step? Or do you feel like that's a good enough start?
They're chatting in now. Great. Thank you. We've had the same question chatted in twice now. Excuse me. I don't know why I'm all of a sudden having a frog in my throat. How to overcome sexual shame. And I invite one of the people who chatted in that question to unmute and expand upon that a bit if they'd like.
I'm ambivalent about you asking them to do that unless they're comfortable, because part of shame, the best answer to getting over sexual shame is to shed light on it, but we've got to shed light slowly. You can't go from the dark to the deepest of the sun. And, when you're, if it's the kind of shame that requires the help of a therapist, I encourage you to find a supportive therapist with some training in healthy sexuality, and not all of them do. But talking about shame, having a healthy support group, if you're comfortable with your sexual partner, talking about how you felt shame, how that shame has affected your ability to be sexual, if you're talking about yourself. Now, if you're talking about it for parents, then one of the ways to help them get over it is for you as the home visitor. We're going back to that implicit model and talking about giving people permission to be sexual in a way that our brains have hardwired our bodies to be. Being shameful about having a genital response makes as much sense as being shameful about getting goosebumps. And when we help people understand that, sometimes people feel shame because they got aroused by something inappropriate. How many parents have gotten aroused by the sight of one of their own children? And if you think about it, if you have a kid that looks exactly like your partner did, you give birth to a boy who by 17 looks exactly like your husband did when you fell in love with him, you might have a physical, genital, or sexual response, but that's nothing. That's just your brain doing its thing. So if we have to understand that having a genital response is physical, acting on it is where we have to start, really getting into value judgments of rights and wrongs. You can't place a value judgment on a physical response. You can place a value judgment on what you do with that response. So Maggie, I'm sorry to cut you off. I just was identifying with the person who maybe didn't want to talk about shame on a Zoom call. So
no problem. It was a layered question. I wasn't sure if we were
okay.
speaking from, and they've had an experience with a client as a home visitor or in a personal context. So I was just leaving space for that, but absolutely, please, any participant, if you have a question and if you feel comfortable, you have the space to unmute. We have another question. Do you think it's important to help highly anxious parents, especially parents who have had their own abuse, to have balanced conversations that don't create unnecessary fear in their child? So I think this is kind of speaking to the earlier question we had about the pregnant woman. So in other words, can parents overdo it and create unhealthy sexual abuse concerns in their children?
I think that's a really hard one to take out of context. I would trust your judgment as a home visitor. If you know the family and you feel like the parent is overdoing it, if you feel like the parent is going too far, that might be something you might work with to help them temper it. If you feel like, because I guess what you want to be able to say to the parent, well, mom, I know what you want to transmit to your child is accurate information, and the fact that they can talk to you, and the fact that no one should touch them in certain ways, and but what you don't want to transmit to your child is your anxiety. So mom, how about if you and I role play, maybe practice, and because that's a great thing you can do as a home visitor, is be the other half of a role play, and you and the mom take turns role playing how to talk to the kid in a way that's sharing accurate information, that's sharing her family's values, and not really infusing it with anxiety, because kids are going to hear the content, or going to hear the feeling, at least as much as they hear the affect.
We just have folks chatting in. Great. Thank you very much to your responses to their questions thus far. Nothing streaming in yet. Just some comments about the importance of destigmatizing language and de-shaming parts of our bodies. And I'm just giving space for folks to chat in if they have any questions. So please feel free to take some sips of tea, Dr. Rosenzweig.
Well, until other questions come up, I will put the slide back on the screen, reminding you how to access your New York State initiative to prevent child sex abuse. and encourage you to keep in touch with that. Remind you that you can get in touch with me at Dr. Rosenzweig at sexwiseparent.org. If you go to my website, you'll find lots of the resources I talked about today. On the resource section, you can download this stuff. You will get the slides through Maggie, but I'll also, every time I do a workshop, I put the slides up, just for a week or so in case anybody wants to go grab them from there. So take a look at some of the blog posts that I've got. I write for the Philadelphia newspaper, so you might find some stuff on the blog that you might find useful in other topics and other ways to handle students. I see one person who is zooming in, is actually reading the info card at their conference table. Yes, she's pointing. So no, good. I'm glad you're reading it. I'm delighted. And I love to be able to at least have a little bit of human interaction. My screen is only showing me about 5 people, and one of you is reading the note card. So we're thrilled to death. So if there's no more, any other questions come in, Maggie?
We have one more,
Sure.
and I will answer the logistic questions at the very, very end because we have folks inquiring about accessing the recording. So we have a question about broaching this subject with families when the kids are present in the visit.
I would not do that unless you talk to the parents about it first, because one of the things that sex abuse is it is an overwhelming boundary violation, and crossing intergenerational boundaries around human sexuality. I mean, even none of us want to think about our parents having sex. None of us want to think about our kids having sex. Now, if the child present is an infant and is not going to understand, well, of course, that's a different story. But to broach the topic in front of even a 3, 4, or 5-year-old, I wouldn't do it unless I had talked to the parent about it in the first place. So, because, or ask the parent, are you comfortable with me bringing up sex abuse prevention issues, with, baby Susie in the room or whatever. I wouldn't do it without getting the parents' permission first, unless the child is still a kind of crib pre-conscious baby.
Okay, thank you. And one more question, which pertains back to the psychosexual stages slides. So you mentioned that children between the period of 6 years old and puberty have a low sexuality. Is there a concern if children in this age period are displaying highly sexual behaviors?
It depends on what we mean by highly sexual. If it's masturbation, it just means that they discovered their genitalia and maybe did have some things happen earlier where they didn't kind of learn to keep that in their room or to keep that private. Anytime we find aggressive sexual behaviors where they're wanting to, at some point it's this, you show me yours, I'll show you mine, as long as there's no force or coercion, that's kind of stuff that happens in families. But anytime a parent is concerned that a child's behavior has crossed the line to aggression or compulsive, then it might, compulsive meaning it's again and again, repeated. I would seek the help of the therapist. But if it's masturbation, if it's curiosity, that's not, and again, look at our note card, look at our fact sheet, and where we really talk about what's expected behavior and what's healthy at each age.
And on the topic of the note card and fact sheet, I know the resources you shared from the American Academy of Pediatrics and the other websites you shared did have Spanish versions, but is the note card available in Spanish as well?
Not yet.
Okay.
On our agenda to have it translated.
Okay, not yet. That was a question. And then just a couple housekeeping items for folks that are asking. Yes, this webinar will be available. The recording will be available. As long as you registered for today, you're on our email listserv. I will send an email to everybody with the follow-up resources. So the slide deck, the note card, and any other resources mentioned today, and a link for how to access the recording. And I will also be contacting folks. I've copy and pasted the participant list. So everybody who joined live today will be rewarded by being entered into the raffle. And you'll get an email from me shortly with details about how I can contact you and get your address to send a copy of the book to. So I don't see any other questions. I see lots of thank yous pouring in. And Dr. Rosenzweig has pasted her email in the chat box. I just want to thank you very, very much on behalf of Prevent Child Abuse New York, on behalf of the Home Visiting Coordination Initiative. This has been incredibly informative, and I know everybody has appreciated it.
It's been my pleasure. And if there's anything else I can do for your agency or community, just track me down. Happy to do it.
Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you, Dr. Rosenzweig.
My pleasure.
Bye-bye. Thank you.